Hi, it's Carolyn here, and welcome to the third part of the Ray Quilt Along. In this video, we will be sewing our projects together. In this video, I will be using all of the pieces that we cut out in the last video, as well as sewing pins, a seam roller. You can check your 1/4" seam allowance with a seam guide, or I have my CF Handy guide here. I'll also be using my sewing machine and an iron and ironing board. If you'd like to know more about the 1/4" seam allowance and how to maybe factor in a little bit of flexibility, check out the last video, part 2, where I talk more about that. I'm definitely someone who likes to use sewing pins, but with this project, for some of the smaller pieces, and certainly with those shorter, like sewing those short ends together, I don't always pin before I just sew. It works out just fine. But certainly with the longer pieces, I use pins. I find that that helps everything kind of come together nice and easily. But if you're someone who doesn't like using pins, that's fine. Whatever you're comfortable with, just go for it. Also, I will be pressing all of my seams open, and I like to first, after sewing them, use the seam roller to get it all open, and then I take it to the ironing board and press it with the iron. I know that using the seam roller might seem like an extra step, but to me, it really makes things a lot easier. It helps me open up those seams so that when I take it to the iron, I don't need to get my fingers close to the iron. I don't have to worry about getting burnt fingers. I like using an iron that's hot and has a lot of steam. So pressing in this way protects my fingers and really helps get a nice, clean, open seam. And while we're talking about ironing, you'll notice that I do use a wool pressing mat, and I have that just sitting on top of my ironing board. I find that it allows me to get a really good press. I'll also be using a small table. It's just a regular folding table that I usually pull up next to me on my left side at the sewing machine. It's really handy to have one of these set up by the machine, because then as your project gets bigger, it helps support the weight of your project. It also gives you a really nice flat surface for using the seam roller to first open up those seams, those longer ones, before you take them to the iron. To see how all of the pieces come together, you can take a look at the quilt assembly diagrams, which are found on page 6 of the pattern, and the pattern is linked below. You'll notice if you look at the diagram, all of the pieces are numbered with the same numbers as in before when we cut out all of the pieces. Starting in the center with the lowest numbers, working our way out. And so that's how we're going to be sewing our pieces together. We're going to start with the first 2 pieces, number 1 and 2, which are found in the center. Then we will add the 3rd piece, and then the 4th piece, 5th piece, etc., until we have all of the pieces attached to our project. Okay, so I've got my machine set up, and I have a magnetic seam guide here at my 1/4 inch, so that way I can when I go to sew, my pieces will run right up against it as a guide, which is helpful. I like using this because it helps make everything consistent. Helps me make sure everything is consistent. Of course, you could use a 1/4" foot, or you can use washi tape on the bed of your machine marking that distance. And then of course, after you make your first seam, you can always double check with a seam gauge. I have my handy guide here, so I might do that after my first seam, just to double check. I have my first 2 pieces of fabric, 1 and 2, and I'm going to sew them right sides together along their shared side. Like I said, you can use sewing pins. Since this is kind of a small piece, I think I'm just going to go for it. And I'm just in the habit of back stitching. If you aren't in the habit of that, you don't have to do it. I do like sewing with my needle down. All right, and I can check my seam allowance just to be sure. That looks great. And then I like to use the seam roller to press, give it a first press, get the seam open. I find that this saves my fingers from getting burned. Okay, and I'm going to take it to the iron. Using that seam roller first means that once I take it to the iron, I can just put it on my ironing board right side up and then pass over it with the iron. Now I'm going to add piece number 3, which goes there. I'm going to flip that right sides together. Again, you can pin or not. I will probably start pinning on my next section. Give it a press with the seam roller. Now take it to the iron. I'll continue on adding one piece at a time in numerical order and working from the center out. I grab the next piece and then I pin it in place, I sew it, then I seam roll it, and then I iron it before adding the next piece. You'll continue doing these steps until all of your pieces are attached. You'll want to press each seam well, but don't overpress it, meaning since we're starting in the center and working out, it might feel natural just to like keep pressing at that center each time, but we don't want to overpress it, we don't want to stretch it or distort it, because we want our quilt top to be nice and flat by the end. Your setup might be different, but here's how I work mine. When your project starts getting a little bit larger, this is when that little extra table comes in super handy. Like I mentioned earlier in the introduction, I have a small folding table. It's nothing fancy, and I slide that table right up next to me on my left side. I love having this table beside me because as my quilt top grows, it gets heavier, and this small table allows for really good support for it, as well as a larger surface area for when I need to seam roll the longer seams open. I've added felt pads on the legs, so then since my ironing board is right next to it, I can just slide it out of the way and then take my project to the iron before I give it a press. Everything is all done. I've now sewn all of my pieces together, so I have one complete quilt top. I'm really excited about this project. It is bright and exuberant, which is exactly what I wanted. Of course, I love quilts that have an overall graphic appeal, but I also love quilts that have little moments of interesting pieces, fun colors, neat fabrics, so that each time it's oriented in a different way on your lap or on your bed, you kind of get a new surprise, something new to engage with and enjoy. This project, I feel like, will definitely have that, and I am really excited about the next steps. Now that the quilt top is sewn together, our next step will be to baste and quilt our project, and that's what we'll be doing in the next video. As always, thank you so much for joining me. Leave comments below, let me know how your project is going, and make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date on all of my latest videos, or follow along on the blog or in my newsletter, which I will have linked below. And I look forward to seeing you again next time.